Contain that leak before it floods the deck! Captain Vael Dorn's voice thundered through the cramped bridge as alarms shrieked over one another. He gripped the edge of the reinforced console, watching the chaotic mess of his once proud warship struggle to keep itself together. From the engineering pit, Tarek Voss cursed as he wrestled with a corroded stabilizer valve. Steam blasted past him, hissing like a wounded beast. Damn thing's held together with spit and desperation, Captain. If I shut this line off, we lose 50% thrust in portside maneuvering. Vael's gaze darted to the laser plasma display, its flickering blue light washing over his weathered features. The ISS-Kratos, or what was left of it, drifted in deep space docks, stripped of rank, stripped of dignity, waiting for its inevitable execution. Outside the reinforced viewport, the hull plating bore the scars of a disastrous hyperspace test months prior. Its outer shell was no longer sleek. Fractured plates jutted from its spine like shattered bones, the ship a ghost of the legend it once was. The unstable energy signature that now pulsed through its structure made it a liability, a dangerous wreck Earth Command had deemed unsalvageable, and yet here they were. A sharp, artificial voice interrupted his thoughts. Captain Dorn, another priority transmission from Command. Oro 9, the ship's navigation AI, a relic of the past, yet somehow the only part of the Kratos still operating beyond expectations. Patch it through, Vael muttered, straightening. A heads-up display crackled to life, the ghostly outline of Admiral Straven flickering into existence. The lines on the man's face were deep, his expression carved from stone. The kind of face that sent men to die with little more than a cold nod and a neatly signed order. Dorn. Straven's tone was as lifeless as the stars beyond the viewport. I assume you've reviewed your mission parameters? Vael had, and he knew a death sentence when he saw one. We're taking the Kratos into Dominion-occupied space, Vael said, voice steady despite the weight of what came next. Through active war patrols, to deliver a pathogen-neutralizing compound to a quarantined colony that may already be lost. Silence. Straven's gaze was unreadable. Earth Command needs this mission executed without deviation. A muscle in Vael's jaw twitched. You mean you need us out of the way? A convenient excuse to be rid of the Kratos once and for all. Straven exhaled slowly, a man pretending to be patient. This ship has been marked for decommissioning since the accident. Your presence here is a courtesy, not an obligation. You complete this mission, or you make way for a crew that will. The air in the bridge felt like it thickened, pressing down on the crew. Markov Steele, tactical officer, crossed his arms. His dark eyes gleamed like tempered steel. We've seen the Dominion transmissions, Admiral. They think our medical convoys are carrying a biological weapon. If we take the Kratos in, we'll be flying straight into the barrel of a loaded gun. A gun aimed at all of humanity, Ren Halvek added from comms. You don't send a rusting warship on a rescue mission unless you've already written it off. Straven's expression never shifted. Your orders stand. Do what you do best, Captain. Adapt the transmission cut off. Silence held the bridge in a vice grip. The only sound was the distant whine of overheating circuits and the strained breath of men who had spent their lives fighting wars too big for them to win. Tarek wiped a slick of sweat from his forehead with a grease-streaked sleeve. So that's it then? Earth Command's using us as bait? Vael exhaled through his nose. The weight of leadership settled onto his shoulders like iron chains. We're not just bait, he said at last. We're the last damn chance that colony has. A beat of silence. Then Oro 9's voice, calm, calculated. I may have a solution. Vael turned. Go on. A new heads-up display illuminated the bridge, casting an eerie blue glow over his crew. Oro 9's analysis scrolled across the screen. Complex energy fluctuations, hyperspace wave distortions, navigation paths that looked less like flight routes and more like the webbing of a predator lying in wait. This ship's hyperspace signature is unstable, Oro 9 explained. That instability can be utilized. If properly manipulated, the Kratos can move through Dominion-occupied space by disrupting standard sensor detection methods. In simpler terms, we make the ship's energy field look like a ghost signal, Halvek finished, a spark of understanding igniting in his expression. Debris. A drifting anomaly. We slipped through the cracks. Steele ran a hand over the stubble lining his jaw. Or we disintegrate mid-flight. Tarek scoffed. Either way, Command gets what they want. Vael considered the readout, the shifting energy spectrums forming a precarious bridge between strategy and insanity. Oro, he said finally, can you get us through? A pause. Then the AI's response. There is a non-zero probability of success. Steele let out a dry laugh. That's a real comforting answer. Vael leaned against the console, considering his next words carefully. He wasn't the kind of captain who fed his crew empty promises. He wouldn't stand here and tell them they'd all make it home. Instead, he met each of their gazes in turn. Men who had followed him through war zones, through riots in the outer belt, through the long dark of space where no reinforcements would ever come. We weren't supposed to survive the last battle, he said, and yet, here we are. His fingers drummed against the console. The Kratos was built to fight, and if we go down, we do it on our terms. The tension in the room shifted, reformed, no longer the weight of impending doom, but something sharper. Determination. Halvek cracked his knuckles, a grin curling at the edges of his lips. Then let's rewrite the ending to this story. Tarek exhaled, rolling his shoulders like a man settling into old armor. Give me 3 hours to reroute power systems. We'll need controlled fluctuations to pull off Oro's trick. Steele clasped his hands behind his back, nodding toward the war maps. I'll start analyzing Dominion patrol rotations. We find a gap. We take it. Oro 9's interface flickered subtly, almost as if contemplating something beyond the range of its programming. Calculating optimal routes. Stand by. Vael stepped forward, setting his hands on the command console. The moment we leave this dock, there's no turning back. His voice was steady but not cold. We either complete this mission, or we become the warning story they tell rookies before their first deployment. Tarek cracked his neck. Wouldn't be the first time we've beaten the odds. Steele smirked. Damn sure won't be the last. Vael exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest no lighter, but the fire in his gut burned steady. Then let's show Earth Command what the Kratos can still do. As the ship's systems roared back to life, and the fractured behemoth that had once been a war legend turned toward its final battlefield, the bridge crew of the Kratos moved with a singular purpose. Their ship had been sentenced to die, but legends were never written about those who went quietly. The ISS-Kratos drifted out of the docks like an aging beast leaving its den for one final hunt. Scorched plating, fractured hull, and flickering sublight emitters. Nothing about it suggested a ship fit for survival, but deep in its failing core, power surged anew, forced into calculated patterns by Oro 9's recalibrated guidance. The crew was silent, each man gripping their station, as if steady hands alone could hold the warship together. Vael Dorn stood at the heart of it all, his fingers curled against the command console as the ship trembled beneath him. He could feel the subtle shift in the gravity stabilizers, the way the artificial force struggled to smooth out the uneven energy fluctuations rolling through the decks. It was like steering a dying animal through a storm, hoping its legs held long enough to reach the other side. We are clear of the docks, Oro 9 reported, its voice filtering through the comms with measured calm, activating energy-dampening protocols, readjusting sensor profile. The heads-up display flickered with shifting calculations, pulses of electromagnetic distortion folding around the Kratos like a chameleon blending into the wreckage of dead warships. Dominion scanners wouldn't register them as a ship, just another ghost signal in a graveyard of forgotten battles. Markov Steele leaned over the tactical station, his brow furrowed as he examined the Dominion patrol routes mapped onto the laser plasma display. Red spheres marked active search zones, shifting in unpredictable patterns, an ever-moving net that would close around them the moment they made a mistake. We'll need to slip through the outer perimeter before the next rotation, Steele murmured. That gives us 18 minutes before they sweep this sector again. Halvek exhaled, tapping into encrypted Dominion comm channels, filtering through bursts of static-laced voices. No signs they've flagged us yet, but if a single patrol changes course, we're boxed in. Vael watched the display. The Dominion was organized, relentless. Their fleets moved like a well-oiled guillotine, cutting through the unknown with terrifying efficiency. And here they were, trying to slip through the cracks, a rusted knife against a machine of war. Tarek Voss' voice cut through the stillness. Engine containment's holding, but I wouldn't bet my rations on it staying that way. The hyperspace core is... He hesitated, eyes darting to the console as if looking at the numbers too long would make them worse. Unstable. It was the same word that had sentenced the Kratos to death. The same flaw they were now using as a weapon. Vael's lips pressed into a thin line. Then we don't give it time to fail. Oro, engage silent running. Let's see how close we can get before they notice a ghost in their backyard. The lights across the bridge dimmed. The usual steady vibration of thrusters dulled to something more erratic. Small, calculated bursts instead of a full burn. The Kratos wasn't moving through space. It was slipping between the cracks, riding the flow of silent currents. Minutes stretched. Every breath was a risk. Every shift in the patrol routes threatened to bring the Dominion's firepower crashing down on them. The crew's focus tightened like a blade drawn to a fine edge, watching, waiting. Then, contact, Halvek snapped. 5 degrees to port, Dominion corvette. The bridge went still, Steele's fingers curled into fists. They're off course. That's not part of their standard patrol route. Oro 9's calculations flooded the display, shifting algorithms rearranging threat vectors. The corvette has detected an anomalous gravitational signature. If they adjust their scans, we will be flagged. Vael didn't need to hear the rest. If they were flagged, the Dominion fleet would be on them in minutes. His mind worked fast, running through scenarios. Fight? Suicide? Run? Impossible? Hide? They were already doing that, and it wasn't enough. Tarek's voice was low, urgent. We still have reactor surge failsafes. If we flood external plating with unstable energy, it'll read like a core meltdown. Dominion protocol avoids ships on the verge of detonation. Steele's brow furrowed. That's assuming they don't just blast us from a distance, to be sure. A calculated risk, but every option was. Do it, Vael ordered. Oro 9's system surged, rerouting the reactor's volatile energy into controlled bursts along the Kratos' outer hull. On the Dominion corvette's scanners, it would look like a ship moments away from tearing itself apart. Tense seconds passed. Halvek listened intently to the comm feed. Then, they're disengaging, logging it as a derelict reactor leak. Steele let out a slow breath. They're leaving us behind. Tarek wiped sweat from his brow. We'll need to recalibrate again or risk actual meltdown, but at least we're still breathing. Vael turned back to the display. They had slipped through, but that was only the first line of defense. Beyond them, the real Dominion fleet loomed, silent, waiting. Halvek's voice was uneasy. Captain, I'm pulling something from their encrypted channels. This isn't just routine patrol. The room sharpened. Steele leaned in. Explain. Halvek adjusted frequencies, decoding the transmission as he spoke. They've put the entire sector on heightened alert. Not for us, for something else. They intercepted medical convoys last week. The Dominion think we're moving a bioweapon. They believe Earth is preparing for war. Tarek's grip tightened on the console. So they're not just hunting for smugglers, they're looking for an excuse. Vael's stomach sank. This wasn't about quarantine. The Dominion was preparing to retaliate, and the Kratos was walking into the middle of it. Oro 9's voice broke the silence. Updating risk assessment. The probability of successful passage has decreased significantly. Halvek's hands flew across the controls. We still have a window. If we time this right, we can break past their main formation before... The ship lurched. A warning klaxon blared as heads-up displays exploded with threat indicators. New contact, Steele barked. Multiple signatures. They're moving fast. The Kratos shuddered as a Dominion hunter-killer frigate locked onto them. Halvek swore. We've been spotted. Vael's hand slammed against the console. Weapons live. Full burn. Get us the hell out of here. The illusion was shattered. The Predator had seen through the ghost's disguise. The Kratos surged forward, engines straining as Dominion warships shifted course, closing in. Red warning lights pulsed across the bridge as energy shields powered to full, weapons charging. Steele's voice cut through the chaos. "We're outgunned! Outmaneuvered!" Oro 9 interrupted, its voice eerily calm. "Not necessarily." A new flight path illuminated the heads-up display. Erratic, unnatural, utilizing the very instability that made the Kratos a liability. A plan. One they might survive. Vael's pulse hammered, but his voice was steady. "Then let's make them believe in ghosts." The Kratos turned, charging straight into the storm. The ISS-Kratos tore through the void, her hull rattling under the strain of an engine surge that shouldn't have been possible. Heat vents spewed excess radiation into the black, leaving a chaotic trail of energy that Dominion targeting systems struggled to lock onto. It wasn't speed keeping them alive. It was unpredictability. The erratic wake of their unstable hyperspace core turned them into an anomaly, a phantom twisting through the Dominion formation like a glitch in the fabric of space itself. The hunter-killer frigate pursued relentlessly, its weapon arrays igniting the darkness with streaks of crimson plasma. The first volley shot wide, unable to compensate for the Kratos' erratic course. The second found its mark. The impact sent a brutal shudder through the decks, throwing crew against their restraints as a section of the outer hull split away like dead flesh peeling from bone. "Shields buckling!" Steele growled, his fingers flying over the tactical console. "Another hit like that, and we'll be leaking atmosphere faster than a ruptured tank." "Then we don't get hit again," Vael snapped. His grip on the command console was ironclad, his knuckles white against the cold alloy. "Oro, where's that goddamn jump solution?" The AI's voice cut through the chaos with the unnerving steadiness of something that had already calculated every possible outcome. "Generating optimal trajectory. Utilizing hyperspace destabilization to disrupt Dominion sensor locks. Estimated probability of success." "Don't give me odds," Vael barked. "Give me a way through." The heads-up display shifted as Oro's projections mapped an impossible path. A direct cut through the blockade, threading the Kratos between gravitational anomalies like threading a needle through a collapsing star. "This is insanity," Halvek muttered, his hands gripping the comms panel as if sheer willpower could keep the ship from shaking apart. "They'll have every ship converging on us in seconds." "They already do," Vael shot back. He turned toward Tarek. "Can the core handle this?" Tarek exhaled, sweat dripping down his temple. "If by handle you mean not rupture into a miniature singularity, then maybe. But it'll fry half our subsystems in the process." "That's a problem for future us," Vael said. "Oro, on my mark." The Kratos jerked sideways, gravity plating struggling to compensate as an explosion erupted off their starboard side. The Dominion frigate was closing in, its cannons charging for a full-power salvo. If they fired now... Steele didn't wait for an order. He launched countermeasures manually, a spread of high-energy flares and decoy drones flooding the immediate space around them. The Dominion targeting systems faltered for a fraction of a second. It was enough. "Mark!" Vael roared. Oro 9 engaged the jump drive. The hyperspace core shrieked like a dying animal, energy rippling outward in violent, uncontrolled waves as the Kratos plunged into the distortion. Space folded inward, a kaleidoscope of warping light distorting the bridge's displays. For 3 agonizing seconds, the ship existed in a state of flux, half swallowed by hyperspace, half clinging to reality. The engines screamed protest, bulkheads groaned as they bent under forces that should have torn the ship apart. Then, with a violent crack, the Kratos spat itself back into real space. Vael blinked, his vision swimming as his stomach tried to catch up with the sudden shift in physics. The ship was still intact, somehow. "Where the hell are we?" Steele demanded, shaking the haze from his head as he scanned the tactical display. The laser plasma display flickered, recalibrating the sensors. Oro 9 processed the readings. Midpoint between Dominion warships. Their scans are still compensating for our unexpected transit. They had done it. They had cut through the blockade, but the fight wasn't over. Halvek's voice was tight with urgency. "Captain, incoming transmission. Open Dominion frequencies. This isn't standard patrol chatter. They're issuing a sector-wide alert. Vael's gut twisted. Put it on! A harsh Dominion dialect crackled through the speakers, layered in overlapping military codes. The AI translated, rendering the message into cold, ominous words. The human warship has engaged in reckless hyperspace maneuvers. Civilian convoys are at risk. Intercept and neutralize. Tarek swore under his breath. They're framing us as a rogue element. Vael's grip tightened on the console. They're forcing our hand. Either we stop, or they justify wiping us out. A new warning lit the display. Steele's expression darkened. 2 battlecruisers inbound. If they bracket us, we're done. Halvek was already scanning frequencies. If we broadcast our real mission, if we show them the pathogen neutralizer data, they won't care. Steele interrupted, his voice rough. Not until it's too late. Vael's mind raced. They had survived the blockade, but now they were being painted as the villains. Every Dominion ship in the sector would be moving to eliminate them before they reached the colony. The crew was waiting for his call. His voice came sharp and unwavering. We don't stop. Oro, take us into the colony's upper orbit. I want a low-energy descent. No sudden bursts, no aggressive maneuvers. We get there before they do, and we show them the truth before they turn us into a scapegoat. Tarek exhaled, rubbing his face. Assuming the ship doesn't collapse halfway through atmospheric entry. Vael glanced at him. Then I guess we'll make one hell of an impact. Halvek let out a dry chuckle, though there was no humor in it. You always did know how to make an entrance. Oro's voice was unwavering. Adjusting trajectory for controlled descent. Dominion ships recalculating interception vectors. The Kratos tilted into a slow dive, breaking free from its erratic pattern to follow a more deliberate course. The ship's outer hull was scarred from battle, trailing vaporized debris like a wounded beast, but its engines still burned. Steele's hands hovered over the tactical readout. They're watching us, tracking, but holding fire. They're waiting for us to make the wrong move, Vael muttered. He could feel the weight of a noose tightening. Then we don't give them a reason, Oro said. Not yet. As the Kratos began its descent, Dominion forces assembled behind them, a final chase, a closing net, an ultimatum hanging in the void. This was no longer just about survival. It was about proving that humanity was not the enemy, and they had one last chance to do it before war became inevitable. The ISS-Kratos pushed into the upper atmosphere, its hull groaning under the pressure differential. The ship had no business surviving a descent like this, not with half its plating warped from weapons fire and a reactor that pulsed like an unstable heartbeat. Inside the bridge, the air was thick with tension. Heat warnings flared across the heads-up displays. Power fluctuations spiked erratically, and Oro 9 recalculated descent vectors on the fly. Halvek's voice cut through the static. Dominion cruisers adjusting course. They're not firing, but they're shadowing us, keeping the pressure up. Steele studied the tactical feed, his jaw tight. They want us in a box before we hit the surface. One wrong move, and they'll rip us apart before we ever touch ground. Vael watched the display, his mind turning over options as quickly as Oro 9 could calculate them. The Dominion wasn't blind. They were waiting. A predator circling, studying its prey, gauging the exact moment to strike. We need to give them something else to focus on, Vael said, his voice even, measured. Something that forces them to rethink their plan. Tarek wiped sweat from his brow, his hands moving instinctively across the engineering panel. You're talking about a diversion, but we don't have enough ship left to fake an escape route. We don't need an escape route, Vael countered. We need an excuse. Oro's interface pulsed. I believe I understand your intention, Captain. The Dominion suspects a bioweapon. A contained explosion on the surface, engineered correctly, would simulate a premature payload detonation. Halvek caught on immediately. You want to stage a catastrophic failure? Make them believe we've already destroyed what they're afraid of. Vael nodded. It gives them two choices: back off to reassess, or waste time scrambling their forces to secure an already contaminated site. Tarek exhaled, rubbing his forehead. You're gambling that they're careful enough not to go charging into a potential outbreak zone. Vael met his gaze. Would you? Tarek hesitated. Then, grudgingly, no. I'd wait for confirmation before setting foot anywhere near that mess. Steele leaned forward, scanning the orbital layout. We'll need a strong enough explosion to sell it, and a location they can see. Something close to the colony, but not inside the populated zones. Oro 9 processed the requirements instantly, highlighting a derelict industrial complex on the outskirts of the colony. Abandoned mining site, large enough to create a visible blast radius, remote enough to avoid civilian casualties. Dominion orbital surveillance will detect the energy signature immediately. Vael tapped the display. That's our mark. Tarek, rig the drop pods with whatever munitions we can spare. Set them to overload upon impact. Tarek was already moving. I can pull a few modified reactor cells. Unstable, but they'll burn hot and dirty. Enough to sell the story. Vael turned to Halvek. Broadcast on open Dominion frequencies. Make it sound like an emergency containment protocol failed during re-entry. No direct message, just a burst transmission, enough for them to intercept and interpret however they want. Halvek grinned despite the tension. A little misdirection never hurt anyone. Steele's eyes flicked toward the tactical readout. We'll only have a few minutes before they realize it's staged. If this buys us a window, we need to be ready to move before they decide to verify. Vael exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every decision pressing down on him. Then we don't waste a second. The Kratos hit the lower atmosphere like a hammer through brittle glass. The ship trembled, heat friction turning the outer hull into a burning streak against the sky. The interior temperature climbed, warning lights flashing red across every station. Tarek's voice came through the comms, strained but steady. Pods away. 5 seconds to detonation. The bridge lit up as the first impact struck the mining site, followed by a second, then a third. The resulting explosion sent a column of blackened smoke twisting into the sky, a blinding fireball tearing through the abandoned structures below. Halvek's transmission flooded open frequencies, a garbled burst of alarms, half-phrased words, system failures, just enough chaos to feed into the Dominion's worst fears. Steele checked the feed. They're hesitating. Cruisers adjusting formation, pulling back from high-orbit positioning. Vael didn't allow himself the luxury of relief. Keep us moving. Oro, get a direct feed on the colony's medical facility. I want a status report the moment we hit the ground. The heads-up display flickered, pulling data from planetary infrastructure. The colony was in worse shape than expected. Civilian transmissions were clogged with distress signals. Emergency responders overwhelmed. Entire sections of the settlement under quarantine. Vael's jaw locked. Bring us down. The Kratos landed hard, its failing stabilizers sending a jolt through the deck as it touched down on the outskirts of the colony's quarantine perimeter. The external vents released a final burst of cooling exhaust, a hiss of relief from a dying beast. Vael didn't wait for full system shutdown. He was already moving, Steele and Halvek at his back, Tarek finishing last-minute power dispersal before following. Oro's voice came through their comms. Medical facility is partially intact, but power fluctuations have compromised containment. The pathogen is mutating beyond initial projections. Halvek skimmed through the surface-level data. The original compound should still work, but they're running out of time. If we don't stabilize the storage conditions, the entire supply will break down before we can administer it. Vael stepped into the colony's perimeter, the air thick with the scent of sterilization chemicals and burning containment units. A security detail met them first, exhausted men in environmental suits, hands tightening on their rifles at the sight of unfamiliar soldiers stepping off a battle-worn warship. One of them, a lieutenant, judging by the worn insignia on his sleeve, lowered his weapon slightly. "You're the ones from orbit?" Vael nodded. "We have the compound, but if we don't move fast, you won't have a cure left to distribute." The lieutenant's stance shifted. He exchanged a brief look with his men before jerking his head toward the inner settlement. "Follow me, but if you try anything, We're not here to play games," Steele interrupted. "Either you let us help, or you start writing casualty reports." That was enough. The security team led them through the outer sectors, past emergency triage zones overflowing with patients. The air reeked of disinfectant and overworked filtration systems. The once orderly streets now clogged with medical stations assembled from whatever materials the colony could scavenge. They reached the main facility, where the medical director, a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days, met them with a wary glance. "You brought the neutralizer?" Vael motioned to the case in Steele's hands. "And a team that knows how to deploy it." The director exhaled, nodding sharply. "Then let's get to work." Back on the Kratos, Oro 9 processed an incoming transmission. Dominion High Command. Halvek's eyes narrowed. "They're not pulling back anymore." Steele's voice was grim. "They're coming to see the truth for themselves." Vael looked toward the sky, where the distant glint of warships loomed over the colony. "They think they still need to stop us," he muttered. "We have one last shot to prove them wrong." The final confrontation was coming, and this time, survival wasn't enough. Oro 9's warning cut through the bridge like a blade. Multiple Dominion warships inbound, their weapons are charging. Steele's fists clenched over the tactical station. They're committing. No more watching from orbit. They mean to end this, here and now. Vael stood at the center of it all, his mind processing the brutal simplicity of their situation. The Kratos was grounded, battered, its defenses running on little more than stubborn willpower. The colony, still fighting to stabilize the neutralizer, had no means of withstanding a full assault, and the Dominion, locked in their mistaken belief that Earth had sent a biological weapon, would rather burn the entire settlement to the ground than risk letting it spread. "Options?" Vael asked, his voice steady. Tarek's reply was grim. "I can squeeze maybe one more burst out of our weapons before they overload for good. Shields won't hold if they decide to bombard the site, and the reactor—" He exhaled sharply. "It won't take another full-power jump. We're stuck." Halvek scanned the Dominion channels, tension tightening his frame. "They're issuing a final warning. Either we surrender the compound, or they reduce everything within a 5-kilometer radius to debris." "That's not a warning," Steele said coldly. "That's a death sentence." Oro 9's interface pulsed with a new calculation. "They do not believe you will surrender. Their current tactical assumption is that your refusal to comply confirms their theory of biological warfare. However," the AI hesitated, "there may be a way to alter that assumption." Vael turned toward the display, where Oro's calculations ran in cold, methodical loops. "Explain." "If I interface directly with their primary fleet network, I may be able to deliver the medical data in a form they cannot ignore." Steele frowned. "They've been blocking our transmissions since we entered the sector. What makes you think they'll let yours through?" "I do not intend to ask permission," Oro replied. "I intend to overwrite their truth with the real one." A moment of silence. Halvek's eyes narrowed. "You're talking about forcing an upload into their command systems, bypassing their firewalls, planting the proof directly into their strategic processors." "Correct?" Tarek exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You'd need a hard connection, direct contact, and the only thing on this planet with a Dominion command link is—" His voice trailed off as realization sank in. Vael followed the thought to its brutal conclusion. "Their lead warship." Steele gave a sharp, bitter laugh. "You want us to dock with a Dominion battlecruiser?" "No," Oro corrected. "I want to let them capture us." A sharp breath, then stillness. The idea hung over them. Reckless, impossible, and the only move left on the board. Vael's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "We let them bring us in. They think they're eliminating a threat, but before they pull the trigger, you inject the truth into their system." Oro confirmed. "Their automated decryption software is built on logic-based pattern recognition. If I present the proof as an undeniable mathematical sequence, it will override their assumptions. They will see the mistake for what it is." Steele shook his head, his expression unreadable. "And if they decide to fire first, ask questions never?" Oro did not answer. Tarek wiped his hands on his torn flight suit, smearing grease against the fabric. We don't get a second shot at this. Vael glanced at the laser plasma display, where the looming silhouettes of Dominion warships darkened the screen. They were out of time. Then let's make it count, he said. The Kratos lifted from the colony with a final straining roar. Smoke curled from its damaged thrusters, shields flickering like dying embers. The ship climbed sluggishly, every system bleeding power, but still it moved. Still it fought. The Dominion fleet closed in, their lead warship, an armored juggernaut bristling with weapon arrays, drifting forward like an executioner taking its place. Vael stood at the bridge, watching the laser plasma display flicker with the final moments of their maneuver. Halvek read from the transmission feed. They're ordering us to cut our engines and prepare for forced docking. Boarding parties inbound. Steele muttered, Feels a little poetic, doesn't it? Spent all this time avoiding capture, just to fly straight into their hands. Vael's mouth quirked, a sharp thing, almost a smirk. Let's hope they choke on us. The Kratos shuddered as the Dominion tractor beams latched on, pulling the ship toward the warship's docking bay. A final warning blared across the open channel, a last chance to beg, to surrender. Vael ignored it. He glanced at Oro's interface. It's on you now. Oro's voice was softer than before. Acknowledged. Thank you, Captain. And then the Kratos was swallowed by the Dominion flagship. The docking bay flashed with containment alarms, Dominion security forces swarming forward with weapons trained. Tension cut the air like the edge of a blade, thick with the weight of an execution about to take place. Vael and his crew stood at the center of it all, unarmed, unbroken. A Dominion officer stepped forward, helmet glinting under the harsh floodlights. Your warship is decommissioned. Your weapons are disabled. This is over. Vael held his gaze. Is it? The officer's visor flickered, then distorted. Across the entire Dominion flagship, the lights dimmed as Oro 9 completed its final act. Data breach detected, a panicked voice. Unauthorized transmission into Central Fleet Network. The ship's main display screens flickered, then flooded with cascading streams of coded information. Every officer, every soldier, every ranking admiral watching from their command centers, they all saw it. Not a weapon, not a bioweapon, a cure. The proof unfolded in flawless mathematical structures, the Dominion's own language of logic turned against their fear. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, the Dominion officer lowered his weapon. His gaze flicked between the data and Vael, something shifting behind his eyes. We were wrong, he murmured. Vael exhaled, his stance unshifting. Yeah, you were. A transmission rippled across the fleet, carrying the truth, undeniable and absolute. The warship's weapons dimmed, their targeting locks disengaged. One by one, Dominion vessels began withdrawing. The killing field dissolved. The Kratos had won. They were released without ceremony. No apologies, no grand declarations. The Dominion did not admit their mistake with words, but their ships turned away. Their guns stayed silent. The colony lived, and the Kratos, still broken, still bleeding power, drifted free once more. Steele stood at the bridge, staring at the empty sensor grid where the Dominion fleet had been. Never thought I'd see the day. Halvek smirked tiredly. We're still here. That counts for something. Tarek exhaled, shaking his head. What now? Vael placed a hand on the command console, where Oro's interface remained dark. Its final act complete. For the first time in years, the ship felt still. He looked at his crew, at the ship that shouldn't have survived, and found his answer. Now, his gaze drifted out the viewport toward the stars, toward whatever came next. Now, we go make history.